Welcome to the second episode of The Bitter Pill, where we look at bitter pills of truth that a lot of people don't want to swallow, and that the corporate media doesn't want us to even know exist. And by the way, you won't see me on this recording because I'm using QuickTime Player and some other software that allows me to screencast and voiceover, but it doesn't allow for it to show me at the same time. So I will work on that for future episodes, find some other software to do this. Anyway, in this episode, we're going to look at biases for a change in decidedly non-corporate media. I'll be showing you part of an interview by liberal YouTube show host Michael Brooks with intrepid independent journalist Abby Martin, whose documentary filmmaking on Venezuela and on Israel and Palestine I really think is wonderful. So in this interview, Brooks and Abby Martin engage in what I feel are some unfair criticisms of Democratic presidential candidate Tulsi Gabbard, as well as being pretty uncritically supportive of Bernie Sanders. And I'm just going to show you the clip where that's what they're talking about. And this interview is really a perfect illustration of the fact that nobody's 100% right, except me, of course. Overall, I don't think this is a hit job. I think some of Michael's videos that have talked about other people on the left in the past kind of have been, but I don't think this one is. Michael acknowledges some positives about Tulsi to a much greater extent than he has in the past, and Abby as well acknowledges some good points about Tulsi. But there's a noticeable double standard here, where they're very critical of Tulsi Gabbard in ways that are often inaccurate or lacking in context, whereas they go out of their way to make excuses for or gloss over any flaws that they acknowledge in Bernie Sanders. So let's look at the interview so you'll see what I mean.
I agree with your broader point 100%. But Abby, we've got an answer. There's a great anti-imperialist congresswoman who's never said anything weird about Islamic terrorism or never had any ambiguous positions on torture, who never went to go see Netanyahu when most Democrats, even people like Tim Kaine, boycotted his speech in the U.S. Congress to try to undermine Obama's Iran deal, which is the best thing Obama ever did. Tulsi Gabbard, right?
Okay, so several things right there. First of all, why is it weird to say that terrorism committed by ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the like in various countries in the Middle East and South Asia is committed by Islamic fundamentalists? Would Michael consider it weird to say, for example, that abortion clinic bombings were committed by Christian fundamentalists? Would it be weird, quote unquote, to say that Israeli settlers in the West Bank committing acts of terror there were Jewish fundamentalists? As for so-called ambiguous positions on torture, there was an isolated comment that Gabbard made a few years ago about when asked about her position on torture, and she constructed sort of a hypothetical scenario where it was like, okay, terrorists are going to blow up the world with nuclear weapons unless you meet our demands or whatever. And she said, well, under those circumstances, I don't know, I might think about torturing them to try to get information to defuse the bombs or whatever. But in general, I am very opposed to torture. Now, shortly after this, she voted for a resolution in Congress in 2015, House Resolution 1735, that 100% banned torture under any circumstances. And to quote what she said at that time, I strongly oppose the use of torture and enhanced interrogations. In 2015, I voted for H.R. 1735, including the amendment to the 2016 National Defense Authorization Act, codifying President Obama's executive order banning enhanced interrogation or torture methods. This ban solidified our commitments to U.S. law and international agreements. Another thing Michael did here was he implied that her attendance at Netanyahu's speech somehow meant endorsement of Netanyahu's position against the Iran deal. But in fact, Tulsi Gabbard supported the Iran deal and has criticized Donald Trump for backing out of it.
Right. Let me start by saying, I appreciate some things she's brought to the table, right? Opposing sanctions,
Yep.
regime change wars, quote unquote, while calling to pardon whistleblowers like Assange. But as an anti-imperialist and anti-war journalist, I think the most important framework to oppose war is the perpetual war on terror that was cemented by Bush and expanded under Obama. I mean, this is drone bombings, this is the extrajudicial assassinations that can be carried out anywhere. And instead of alleging that radical Islamic terrorism is the fundamental threat, I mean, I'd rather address that much of the terrorism committed is a direct blowback from U.S. foreign policy, which is terrorism itself. Like Chomsky said, if you want to stop terrorism, stop committing terrorism. I mean, look at bin Laden, who said that U.S. bases and troops in Saudi Arabia fueled his rage against the U.S. Look at al-Baghdadi, tortured in Abu Ghraib. ISIS grew out of the vacuum of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. I mean, it's strange to me, I think, aside from all of that, which I disagree with her fundamentally on, and I think our bar is set very low for what is considered anti-war, anti-imperialism in the mainstream discourse, I find it very strange that Tulsi Gabbard is running against Bernie Sanders. That, to me, is why I dislike her the most.
Okay, well, several things there. First of all, as far as framing the causes of terrorism, Abby is kind of misframing things to say that Gabbard is solely attributing terrorism to Islamic fundamentalist ideology and not to blowback from U.S. foreign policy. In fact, she's very clear that key elements of U.S. foreign policy, such as the alliance with Saudi Arabia, the direct and indirect backing of Islamic fundamentalists, which has been going on really for decades. The U.S. made the Taliban a major force back under Carter and Reagan in the late 70s and 1980s. And on and on. The massive support for Israel, U.S. military bases all over the place, and of course the perpetual wars that obviously have pissed a lot of people off in that part of the world. These things have indeed contributed to the growth of both Islamic fundamentalists and anti-U.S. views and played a major role in the blowback. And Tulsi has said that over and over and over again. As for her next comment, well, let me I meant to stop it before it got to this. But so she says, I find it very strange that Tulsi Gabbard is running against Bernie Sanders. That, to me, is why I dislike her the most.
Why is she running against Bernie? Why is Elizabeth Warren running against Bernie? If they cared about defeating Trump, they would not be running against Bernie Sanders.
Okay, so she's lumping Tulsi in there with Elizabeth Warren and saying that neither of them must care about defeating Trump, or otherwise, why would they be running against Bernie Sanders? Well, several things to say about that claim. First of all, Tulsi and Bernie met prior to her announcement that she was running, which came over a month before Bernie's announcement that he was running. And at that meeting, she told him she was thinking of running, and she wouldn't have run without his blessing at that meeting. The whole purpose of the meeting was to discuss the fact that she was considering running, and clearly she received it. She says that he approved. And Abby is seeming to forget here that Tulsi has been a strong supporter of Bernie's, who put her political career on the line to support him, as well as call out the corruption of the DNC, the rigging of the primaries, and so forth, in 2016. So it really just doesn't make any sense to me for Abby to imply that a purpose of Tulsi Gabbard running is to undermine Bernie Sanders' effort to get the nomination, should he be in contention for it, and her not in contention for it following the primaries. There's no reason to doubt that if Bernie is in contention for the nomination, and Tulsi isn't, come July 2020, Tulsi's going to support him 100% and encourage any pledged delegates she has to support him as well. So I just find it strange what what Abby's saying here. I mean, she's not running a third-party campaign. She's running for the Democratic nomination. And It's always possible to make backroom deals if someone realizes they're not going to win, to uh, throw their support to a candidate they like who does have a chance of winning. And if Sanders is in a position to win and Gabbard is not, that's what's going to happen. Abby also makes no mention of how likely it is that the DNC is going to rig things against Bernie Sanders, or whoever else they don't want to win in 2020, just like they did in 2016. There's already extraordinary bias against Bernie, and even more against Tulsi in terms of media coverage. So there's just no reason to assume that there won't be voter suppression and other underhanded tactics by the political establishment during the primaries, just like there was last time. And there's no reason whatsoever to think the superdelegates won't get behind whichever establishment candidate is the leading contender, should there not be a candidate who has a majority of the pledged delegates, which that's very likely to happen. So, likely the only way that Bernie or Tulsi could get the nomination is if they won a majority of the pledged delegates. But with so many candidates at this point, we just had yet another billionaire enter the race yesterday. Oh boy. With that many candidates, it just seems unlikely that anybody's going to get a majority. So it's going to go to a second ballot where the superdelegates get to cast their votes for the establishment candidate of their choice. Okay, let's get back to the video.
And also, it's weird that she just said she's not running for Congress anymore. I mean, if she cares about fighting the entrenched and corrupt Democratic establishment, why is this an all-or-nothing thing to win the presidency? I find that very strange. Not to mention the pivoting on Medicare for all.
Okay, well, regarding her not running for Congress, if she's really going to take the presidential campaign all the way to the convention, as she says, that's not going to leave her very much time to campaign for Congress. And it's pretty clear that the DNC, the established Democrats, they are primarying her, even though she's the incumbent. They're launching a campaign by this establishment candidate, whose name I'm blanking on right at the moment. But he's just this horrible neoliberal and just very, nasty person who's already engaged in all these nasty personal attacks against Tulsi that are just completely unfounded. And she just would rather not deal with that. And of course, she can run for some other office at some point in the future. That's not ruled out. So I'm not sure what Abby's problem is. Now, as for supposedly pivoting on Medicare for all, in other words, supporting it, being a co-sponsor of the Medicare for all bill in the House of Representatives, Jayapal's bill, and saying she supported it, and supposedly backing out of that at some point. The reality is that Tulsi Gabbard has not changed her position at all on Medicare for all. She's consistently maintained that she favors a Medicare for all system wherein all taxpayers pay Medicare tax just like they do now, only it'll be higher because they're funding universal health insurance. Everyone will be eligible for Medicare, but under her proposal, people are allowed to have private plans if they choose, which is a case in a lot of other countries in the world that have very good universal health care. For example, Australia has a plan very similar to what she's proposing. Now, that doesn't mean that that's a perfect system. There's certainly problems with the way that, for example, the Australian system works. But, if you want to criticize Tulsi's proposal, which she hasn't even released the details of yet, if you want to criticize it for not being as good as Bernie Sanders' plan or the plan in the House that Tulsi is a co-sponsor of, fine. But don't accuse her of not backing Medicare for all or being inconsistent in her position, because these things are not true. She's consistently said that when it comes to writing the legislation that's actually proposed and implemented, as opposed to proposals presidential candidates throw out during the campaign, as if they weren't in Congress, the proposal that they make is going to be a bill in Congress necessarily. It's not going to necessarily be a bill in Congress. They're going to be president. Folks in Congress are going to come up with a bill, and you know, if it's a Medicare for all bill, when it comes to her desk, and if she's president, she'll sign it. Why would anybody not think that, given how consistent she's been in, what she's said in support of Medicare for all?
Where all these people are now poisoning the well on what that even means, the Medicare choice. This is a country that is beholden to corporations. We are uniquely captured by corporate power.
I'll underline again, even though
Medicare choice thing is not gonna work here. So I don't understand why we can't just be honest and clear. And unfortunately, a lot of the critiques from her are coming from dishonest actors, where it's being framed the wrong way. Because to me, I would like a lot more left critique about these issues that you and others have done.
I agree with you completely, and I'll underline again, even though, for people who can't deal with any criticism for her, she's 100% right on Julian Assange, and the charges against him are a fundamental threat to journalism everywhere, and particularly to great journalists like Abby, frankly, who do analogous work. I'll add, I've noted this on other streams, but I'll just note quickly, regardless of what you think of his work and where you come in, it doesn't matter. The arrest of Max Blumenthal is a major threat and a major danger, and also, I have no doubt, cooked up by far-right Venezuelan opposition forces. So, and she was right to oppose regime change efforts in Venezuela. She's been right on a variety of issues, but the thing is that it's not. And she's also been radically wrong on a variety of issues, and it's not structural at all, like
Right.
You're saying. And Sanders, again, people always nitpick. Yes, he did not shoulder like every single wrong for decades, right? Like I think there was an element of like Bernie is totally isolated in modern politics. For decades, he's basically the only person saying that like poor people are human beings, as an example. And maybe he goes along to get along on certain foreign policy issues. I think that's totally a fair critique, but you should historicize that critique. On the other hand, this is a guy who is tweeting out solidarity with people in Haiti and Chile and calling for freeing Lula today, who voted against 3 military budget increases today, where Warren voted for each of them and Tulsi voted for at least one of them. And Gabbard has had nothing to say on the solidarity and justice front. And I just also want to play this video because I do think you can't escape the fact that you go back to the Syrian refugee vote, the fact that when she first got any kind of public attention, it was like obsessively like going on TV to complain that Obama wouldn't call it Islamic terrorism. And I just want to contextualize this a little bit. This is a video she just put out. And Erdogan, obviously.
Okay, a few things I wanted to comment on here. Essentially, overall, Michael, and Abby does this too, sidesteps any specific criticism of Bernie Sanders. He plays up his tweeting solidarity with Lula and various other genuine expressions of solidarity with various movements and activist individuals. He plays up his voting against military budgets in recent years, but he doesn't really take this perspective toward Tulsi Gabbard. He's constantly trying to find things to criticize about her, and he doesn't do that with Bernie Sanders. Now, in terms of, on the solidarity front, he overlooks that Tulsi personally protested in solidarity with protesters of the oil pipeline Standing Rock as part of a contingent of veterans that went there for that. She also traveled to Puerto Rico recently to protest with Puerto Ricans who were trying to get rid of their corrupt government. Uh, in terms of specific things that Michael could have brought up with regard to Bernie, if he were at all inclined to criticize Bernie Sanders, um, Bernie tweeted all these disingenuous criticisms of Maduro and the Venezuelan government that were basically CIA talking points. Let me see if I can find some and show them to you. He said, the Maduro government has waged a violent crackdown on Venezuelan civil society, violated the Constitution by dissolving the National Assembly, and was re-elected last year in an election many observers said was fraudulent. The economy is a disaster and millions are migrating. He went on to say, the United States should support the rule of law, fair elections, and self-determination for the Venezuelan people. We must condemn the use of violence against unarmed protesters and the suppression of dissent. So, I mean, Bernie, what the hell? Venezuela had a election a couple of years ago, or about a year and a half ago, that was observed by international observers, dozens and dozens of international observers, I think over 100 from all over the world, and universally they said that the election was free and fair. The so-called violent crackdown on Venezuelan civil society involved, yes, there was conflict between the Venezuelan military and folks trying to overthrow the government. But when you have folks such as Juan Guaido and his backers, you very wealthy people who no longer hold power in Venezuela at this point, other than privately. They don't hold much power in the government, but they're trying to violently overthrow the government. And the government doesn't even put them in jail a lot of the time. Juan Guaido is a free man, even though he's calling for the United States to send its military down and help them overthrow Maduro's government. Now imagine if that happened here. We would not tolerate it. Our government would not tolerate it. That person would be in jail. As the economic disaster, I mean, come on, Bernie. There have been sanctions on Venezuela for years. The price of oil, which is like 90% of Venezuela's earnings in terms of income from foreign sales of their products, oil prices went in the tank many years ago. The folks trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government, the wealthy capitalist sector of Venezuelan society, has been carrying out economic sabotage in Venezuela for many years. So to say that it's all Maduro's fault or his government's fault that the economy is a disaster is just freaking ridiculous. And actually, I should have looked this up. I'm blanking on his name, but a UN observer, a human rights observer from the UN, came in and you took a look at how the sanctions were affecting Venezuelan society and argued that, in his estimation, tens of thousands of people, maybe 40,000 or so, were being killed every year because of how severe these sanctions were. In contrast to that, Tulsi Gabbard has directly called out the oil interests behind the attempts at regime change in Venezuela. And she's not tweeted out criticisms of the Venezuelan government. Basically, what she has said is the U.S. should stay out of Venezuela. That's what she has argued. So don't give me that, Michael. Michael also mischaracterizes Tulsi Gabbard's voting record on the military budget. She has not voted for any of Trump's military budgets, and she voted against Obama's in 2016. Now, Bernie has also opposed the military budget, or voted against the military authorization, the National Defense Authorization Acts each year for the last several years. But in fact, like Tulsi, he supported a number of military budgets under Obama. In fact, Bernie supported 6 out of the 8 military budgets that Obama proposed. He voted for them. He also voted for 3 of George Bush's military budgets. So, and there's just a long list of things that you could criticize about Bernie's foreign policy. In the 1990s, for example, he supported sanctions against Iraq that killed hundreds of thousands of people and caused mass suffering and devastation to Iraq's economy. He voted for a 1998 resolution that also included support for the sanctions that called for the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, Iraq's leader at the time. He voted in 2001 for authorization, that congressional authorization that permitted George Bush to invade Afghanistan, wage war in Afghanistan, and pretty much wherever Bush wanted. There was only one member of Congress who opposed that, and it wasn't Bernie Sanders. Bernie also supported military action against Libya, which eventually he turned against it, but it was a complete disaster, and initially he supported it. And he's also been pretty supportive of military intervention in Syria for the most part, which Tulsi has consistently opposed.
Has played a horrible role across the Middle East. Because for decades, he's basically the only person saying that like poor people are human beings, as an example. And maybe he goes along to get along on certain foreign policy issues. I think that's totally a fair critique, but you should historicize that critique. On the other hand, this is a guy who is tweeting out solidarity with people in Haiti and Chile and calling for freeing Lula today, who voted against 3 military budget increases today, where Warren voted for each of them and Tulsi voted for at least one of them. Nope. And Gabbard has had nothing to say on the solidarity and justice front. And I just also want to play this video because I do think you can't escape the fact that you go back to the Syrian refugee vote, the notion of wasting resources and things that are in the U.S.
fundamental flaw in her worldview, that this is about radical Islamic terrorism driving these movements, and we know that that's kind of a really narrow and frankly right-wing viewpoint. And again, I think that she should really quit the military, because if you want to paint yourself as an anti-war, even remotely anti-war candidate, I don't understand why you are in an active duty military service. I find that very strange as well.
Right.
I mean, and also, has she even denounced the military budget and talked about, the need to maybe she has, but again, I mean, back
she
to the
has
point
in
about
some
Bernie.
way. I mean, she's voted mixed ways. She sometimes talks about military spending, the military-industrial complex. But even there, I would say there's a, look. Anytime you make a statement like this, I'm sure that she said military-industrial complex. I know it's sometimes she's talked about civilian casualties, but the overwhelming focus is on this notion of wasting resources and things that are in the U.S. national interest or not. And this other dynamic that you have here is a very strange view of Islam, which I don't,
Okay, guys. So I cut this out to save time, but he played a video of Tulsi criticizing Erdogan's support for Islamic terrorists who are trying to overthrow the Syrian government. And Michael criticized her for saying that Erdogan was himself a radical Islamist and wanted to establish a Muslim caliphate. He called that a right-wing conspiracy theory. Now, I don't know enough about Erdogan to have an opinion about Tulsi's claim on that front. Maybe she knows something that I or Michael don't. But in any case, the important point here, I think, is that she's pointing out that Turkey is collaborating with Islamic fundamentalists, just as the U.S. is, in an effort to overthrow the sovereign government of Syria, resulting most likely in a situation pretty much like Libya or Iraq, where you have complete chaos and devastation, and despite the fact that uh, you know Bashar al-Assad's not a nice guy, the situation, if there was a war that succeeded in overthrowing him, would be way worse than it currently is, and definitely worse than if um, you know Islamic terrorists trying to overthrow him hadn't been backed in the first place. Um, Now, as you heard, Abby criticized Tulsi for being active in the military, but a couple of things she ignores. First of all, Tulsi is in the National Guard, which is not very likely to be deployed in most wartime situations. And also, she's a medic. It's not like she's going to go shooting people in a war that she opposes. Um, in fact, I'm guessing that if they tried to get her to go to a war that she was morally opposed to, she would not go. She's a different person in that regard now, certainly than when she um, was a gung ho soldier during the Iraq War, because, as she said, she believed the lies then about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and Iraq collaborating with the terrorists who attacked us on 9/11. And Abby also questions whether Tulsi has called for cuts in the military budget. So something that if you listen to Tulsi Gabbard on the campaign trail, you hear her emphasize over and over and over again that we need to make massive cuts in the military budget. We've wasted, I think the figure is $6 trillion on these regime change wars and other military actions we've taken over the years. Most of them are efforts to overthrow governments, regime change wars, and frequently talks about that we have to do this because we're wasting money that we could be using for domestic needs, like infrastructure, for example, cleaning up the water supply in Flint, Michigan, and other places that have dirty water, other environmental cleanup projects, transitioning to clean energy. Tulsi Gabbard is the only member of Congress to date who has proposed a comprehensive bill to take action on climate change and achieve 100% clean energy by 2035, ban fracking, ban nuclear power, etc. Nobody else in Congress has done that. She's also in support of a free college and many other domestic reforms. And Michael claims that the overwhelming focus of her statements about foreign wars has been on the waste of resources involved. And that's just not true. She's been talking just in the last few days a lot, as she has before, about the massive human cost of these wars, not only for our soldiers who are put in harm's way, but also for the people who live in these countries who have been killed in large numbers and injured and had their homes destroyed, been made into refugees. That's the main cause, she points out, of the massive, the millions of refugees from Syria and other war-torn countries where they're war-torn because of the United States. So, she's very much about the human cost of war, both here in the United States and in these other countries where the wars are being fought.
Of Islam, which I don't, look.
Sorry. Viewpoint. And again, I think that she should really quit the military, because if you want to paint yourself as an anti-war, even remotely anti-war candidate, I don't understand why you are in an active duty military service. I find that very strange as well.
Right.
I mean, and also, has she even denounced the military budget and talked about, the need to maybe she has, but again, I mean, back
she
to the
has
point
in
about
some
Bernie
way. I mean,
Sanders.
she's voted
Yeah.
mixed ways. She sometimes talks about military spending, the military-industrial complex. But the notion of wasting resources and things that are in the U.S. national interest or not, and this other dynamic that you have here is a very strange view of Islam, which I don't, look, I don't like to super go in this direction, but people can look up her family's guru and what the guy said about Muslims. It's not that hard to find. And, this is somebody who yes, she spent time in the Middle East. She has a certain understanding from a military standpoint, but I don't think she spent that much time figuring out what the difference between Shia or Sunni is, or the difference between political movements. Like, even you were just saying, like, does she know that the communist...
Okay, well, I mean, I guess my reaction to this is, what about her views on Islam? Not somebody who was a central figure in her life, her Hindu religious guru when she was a child, but what are her views on Islam? Michael couldn't even be bothered to look them up. They're right there on her website, tulsigabbard.org. By the way, I'll put links to all the resources I'm talking about in the description of the video, so you can look things up there if you like. And Tulsi has commented a lot about the fact that Islamic fundamentalists are terrorizing mainly other Muslims, not only religious minorities in Muslim majority countries. And other Muslims use the same exact language to talk about terrorists like ISIS and Al Qaeda, that they are Islamic extremists and so on and so forth. Because they're the ones that are on the front lines. They're the ones that are being most harmed by the terrorism sponsored by Saudi Arabia and Pakistan and so on and so forth. They're the ones that it's hurting.
This party is a force in Gaza. I profoundly doubt it. And also look at her comments on, Kashmir. And then look at actually, in fact, how the small band of people that, follow her, they start, all of a sudden I see people who, maybe they thought Pakistan was like a restaurant, all of a sudden talking about ISI agents infiltrating India, which, by the way, that is an issue. But when I see people who have no basis for talking about any of these things, all of a sudden echoing the most extreme Indian foreign policy talking points, and it would be absolutely the same if it was somebody echoing the most extreme ISI Pakistani talking points. That's not the point. Is not the country. The point is the location of the policy, and it's very bizarre that she's a conduit for that. And I agree. Look, of course, everybody besides Bernie is bullshit, and I think that critique applies equally. But it's very weird to see how, especially as Bernie, I mean, you have Ilhan Omar saying he's going to end Western imperialism in front of his speech. I don't know, like, I didn't expect to hear that shit. I don't know what more people, we want policy, but you know what I'm saying.
Right, I mean...
So Ilhan Omar says Bernie's going to end Western imperialism. Does anybody who's familiar with Bernie Sanders' foreign policy record over the last several decades, if they really truly understand what he's voted for and what he supported, are they really going to believe that? I don't think so. And I'll put a link to a summary of his foreign policy record in the description of the video. But we would have to go through a whole nother video to talk about the situation with the conflict which stretches back to the birth of India and Pakistan as independent countries, between India and Pakistan, with all the terrorist attacks that have taken place within India by groups sponsored by Pakistan. Certainly there have been many human rights violations by the Indian government under both major parties, the BJP and the Congress Party. There has been a long history of internecine violence in India involving principally Muslims and Hindus, but also other religious minorities such as Sikhs, where you can't point the finger at one religious group or other faction and say they're to blame for everything. There's many parties at fault there, and nobody who who pushes back on the narrative that's been become commonplace in the U.S. That's everything bad that happens in India is Modi's fault or the BJP's fault. Just because people push back on that narrative doesn't mean that they are like 100% behind the current Indian government, and that applies to Tulsi too. She's taken a very clear position that she wants peace in India and everywhere else, and she's not taking sides. She's not supporting one particular party or political group or religious group or whatever within India.
Bernie, again, he has proven himself for decades. He was a member of the Progressive Caucus when Elizabeth Warren was still a Republican, and when Tulsi Gabbard was in, a cult that's a very vehemently homophobic and anti-Islam cult.
Okay, come on, Abby. Tulsi was a young teenager at the time that you're talking about, which was in the 1990s when Warren was still a Republican, and Tulsi Gabbard was, a young girl whose parents were from conservative backgrounds, kind of a conservative denomination or faction or whatever of Hinduism, and her dad was Catholic. So she grew up with these sorts of views where she was anti-abortion and had some negative attitudes toward gay people. I don't know that the so-called cult that she was involved in was itself Islamophobic. The leader of it made some Islamophobic comments at some point. But let's not forget that society in the 1990s was backward on many of these issues here in the United States. Almost every Democratic politician back then was opposed to gay marriage. You couldn't be openly gay in the military. We had the Don't Ask, Don't Tell Act signed by Bill Clinton, which made it clear that marriage was something between a man and a woman, and so on. And also Islamophobia was rampant at that time. And as far as Tulsi is concerned, well, she was in her mid-teens back then, early to mid-teens. She's in her late 30s now. She's a grown woman. She has her own views, which have for many years been very much supportive of gay rights, and are very much against any sort of religious or ethnic bigotry. This is a theme that she has emphasized over the years, the opposition to bigotry of any kind. And she herself is a woman of color, of mixed white and Polynesian heritage. Her own dad was subjected to segregation laws back when he was a kid. So this sort of rhetoric, and I'm honestly shocked to hear it coming from Abby Martin. It treats Tulsi as if she's still a child, incapable of having her own views that aren't driven by what some man thinks, whether it be Chris Butler, one of many so-called gurus she's had as a Hindu over the years, or her dad, or various other people that she's simply met with, like Modi or Donald Trump or whatever. Constantly the smear is thrown at her that somehow, because she's had contact with uh, people, particularly men, who have this or that objectionable view, that she holds that same view, and it's just nonsense. And honestly, it comes across as very sexist. Now, again, in closing, I just want to say again, I very much respect Abby Martin's work as as an independent journalist. I'm not sure I approve nearly as much of the work that Michael Brooks has done, but just to be fair, he did say some positive things about Tulsi. He wasn't just bashing her 100%. But I just want to plead with these people to not jump on the Tulsi smear train and to take a close look at what she actually stands for. Go to her campaign website, tulsi2020.com, or a website that goes into much more detail about her views and record, tulsigabbard.org. And then you can critique her. Don't just be an armchair critic, a talking head who hasn't done their homework.
I think it's just really important to kind of attach and hitch our wagons to the person that we can rely on, and who is also, most importantly, Michael, making this about us, the organizer in chief. This is not about him. This is about us mobilizing ourselves, pushing these policies through. Because there is no savior 2020. Bernie is the most likely candidate that will be able to represent the masses wherever we move ourselves and push him forward to do. And that is the most important thing about this election. And I do not see anyone else waiting in the wings that can possibly take up the mantle to prove himself the way that Bernie Sanders has over the last 40 years, whether it be LGBTQ rights, whether it be fighting the military-industrial complex, fighting on behalf of veterans. The list goes on and on and on. And that's who I trust, and it's kind of shocking that progressives are so confused in this election because we have so much at stake. We have so much at stake, and Trump needs to be beaten, and there's only one candidate that can really get that done.
So, I will certainly give Bernie credit. I have in the past for recognizing the point that just electing him or some other progressive politician to the office of the president or having a progressive majority in Congress in and of itself is not going to fundamentally change society. He has said over and over again that there has to be a mass movement fighting for change in order for it to happen. And kudos to Bernie for saying that. I should note that Tulsi Gabbard has also said that very same thing. But again, Abby is whitewashing his record here. He doesn't have all that progressive a record on foreign policy, and I will link to an article that documents that point by point and year by year. And it's highly questionable to me whether Bernie has really proven himself capable of being a good movement leader at all. The way he meekly folded after being cheated during the 2016 primaries, remaining silent about that. Then he vigorously campaigned for the corrupt warmonger Hillary Clinton that he had previously been vigorously campaigning against. To me, that raises serious doubts about his leadership capabilities. And I think possibly that's one reason why his support doesn't seem to be as strong so far at this time as one might expect. The other being, of course, the sheer number of candidates in the race. But I don't know. He made a lot of his supporters very angry when he backed down to such an extent to the DNC back in 2016. And he's really showed a lack of courage and integrity in that case, and there are others. I mentioned his parroting CIA talking points about Venezuela. He's also pushed Russiagate a lot. Uh, he's engaged in this fulsome praise of John McCain and George Herbert Walker Bush when they died, saying they were heroes and friends of his and so forth. He was dead silent on Julian Assange's arrest back in early April of this year. He didn't say anything about it for a month and a half, and then finally, when other politicians, even Elizabeth Warren and a host of other people, were coming out speaking out against the Trump administration's charges against Julian Assange under the Espionage Act, finally he did speak out and say that we shouldn't be using the Espionage Act to prosecute journalists, but he didn't even mention Julian Assange's name. And just recently, there was a situation where a filmmaker made a viral video, praising various aspects of Bernie's stands on the issues and really caring about people, and juxtaposing what the media was saying about Bernie with the reality, and showing the horrible media bias. And this video was watched by millions and millions of people, and the Sanders campaign was all set to hire this guy, and then somebody started a smear campaign against him, and all of a sudden, they didn't want to hire him. So yet again, Bernie failed to stand up for somebody who needed for him to stand up for them. And I'll put a link to that in the description as well. Now let's contrast that with Tulsi Gabbard's outspoken criticism of the military-industrial complex and the war machine, her critique of Hillary Clinton, the queen of warmongers and so forth, her face-to-face confrontation with the smear merchants at The View recently, where they had called her a useful idiot for Russia, just outrageous attacks, and she confronted them directly there on the show. And she's been out in front on issue after issue legislatively as well as rhetorically. I mentioned the climate change bill that she proposed 2 years ago. Just recently, she put forward a bill to legalize marijuana, a bill to reinstate the fairness doctrine, a bill to cut off aid to terrorists. It's been funneled to them directly in some cases and indirectly in others. A bill calling for the withdrawal of troops in Syria, which neither Bernie nor anyone else in Congress has thus far been willing to support. So, I don't think that Abby or Michael have been fair to her, in short. Now, lest you think there's nothing that I am critical of Tulsi about, I've just said that Abby and Michael seem pretty reluctant to criticize Bernie. There are issues that I disagree with her about. I'm very much supportive of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, the BDS movement, to oppose the Israeli occupation of Palestine and really put pressure on them to change. And Tulsi is opposed to that movement, even though she has been critical of the Israeli government and the Israeli occupation of Palestine and called for it to end. She is reluctant to put that kind of pressure on them. I also think that the Democratic Party is unreformable, and that Tulsi is just not quite in touch with reality there if she thinks that it is reformable. And she's also said recently, when asked her opinion of the Democratic Party, that it used to be an anti-war party. And I'm wondering when she thinks that was. I can't remember any time when it has been, or recall reading any time about the Democrats being an anti-war party. They've been supporting wars for more than 100 years. Woodrow Wilson got us into World War I. But anyway, she is calling out the political establishment in ways that no Democratic politician has done in decades. She has more courage and integrity and basic decency than any Democratic Party politician that I'm aware of in a great many years. She's a leader, and there's absolutely no doubt that she belongs in this race. And if she gets the support, she'll stay in the race until the convention, and we'll see what happens then. Thanks for watching The Bitter Pill. Please like and subscribe if you like what you've seen. And if you have a little change to spare, support us on Patreon.